everyone, if you can sit down for the last panel of this extraordinary conference. Great. Okay, let's get started. I'm just going to start talking because then there will be silence. I'm not Susan Wiseman, who was supposed to be moderating. She sadly couldn't make it. I'm Natasha Leonard from the New School. Very sad to have lost Clara to Tulsa, but so excited for the birth of Shay, long may it live. And thank you for organizing this, Clara, Scott, Jisoo especially. Welcome to the last panel. I hope we can all celebrate later and continue to support the center and its efforts and every effort for an economics of resistance, which is why it's so relevant that we end talking about the crises of care and climate. It's really interesting, equivocal plural there. Crises of care, crises of climate. And, you know, the entirety of waged labor, non-waged labor, and habitat that includes, which I'm sure we'll cover expansively, and especially the way we can talk about production and reproduction of life in these times. We're going to start with Debora Nunes. Hello. Debora Nunes is an assistant professor of economics at Monmouth University. She holds a PhD in economics from Colorado State University, where she worked as an instructor and teaching assistant. Debora has a master's degree in development economics from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, and a bachelor's degree in economics from the same institution. She was also an invited student at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics. Debora's professional experiences include internships at the Central Bank of Brazil and the Southern Brazil Regional Development Bank and research assistantship for the Feminist Economics Journal. In the private sector, she owned a cultural production company and worked as a producer and professional dancer for several years. That's cool. Her research interests and published work debate feminist economics, history of economic thought, Latin American studies, and macro-political economy. Debora, take it away.
Hi, I think my slides are here somewhere. They are. Okay, cool. Hi everyone, I am just so excited to be here. I really want to thank Clara and Scott and Jisoo, and from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank my comrade Bruno as well. Just a little anecdote, Bruno and I met back in 2011 or 12 in a student organizing movement down in Brazil, and we immediately bonded over our push for more critical thinking into economics, and we've been friends since then, and so look at how far we came. I'm so proud of him, and I'm so honored to be him and to be his colleague and to be his friend. So, yeah, I'm here to talk about reproductive justice. And so, because this is gonna get like really depressing really quick, I'm gonna start with a quote about love, which is from Che Guevara, which is obviously appropriate from this space. So the quote says, "Déjame decirle a riesgo de parecer ridículo que el revolucionario verdadero está guiado por grandes sentimientos de amor," which means that, let me tell you, at the risk of sounding ridiculous, that the true revolutionary person is guided by immense sentiments of love. And I truly do believe in that. And so the panel is about the care crises in the plural and the environmental crisis. But my talk is going to be a little bit more about the care side of things, and then my dear comrades and other folks in the panel are definitely going to bring the environmental side. So I'm going to start with some definitions because of the horrors that are happening in the US and throughout the world in terms of kidnapping our reproductive decisions and destinies. Reproductive justice became very popular in academia and in organizing movements. And I think that it's very important for us to rescue the origins of it and the history of it, precisely because it was invented, put together by women of color and immigrant women in the United States. And so it's very important to not let that history vanish, or to not remember us who came up with this framework and why it's so relevant. So the sister song, Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, was created in the US in the late 90s. And it took a little more than a decade to start invading more mainstream spaces of women's rights and reproductive rights. But what's so unique and so important about this framework is that they try to merge the social justice movements with the reproductive rights movement. So that's where reproductive justice comes from, the name. And every time that I say that I'm going to talk about reproductive justice, most of the audience thinks that I'm going to talk about abortion specifically. But the core of the reproductive justice movement is to guarantee equally important and three fundamental rights of humans. And yes, one of them is the right to not have a child if you don't want one, to deny or delay parenthood for as much as you want. But equally important and part of our reproductive decisions, if you have the right to say no, we should also have the right to say yes. Yes, I want to build a family. Yes, I want to be a loving parent. And I want to become the best parent that I can and provide to the new generations of this world the best life that it's in my ability to do so. So equally important are the right to have a child and to parent children in a safe and a healthy environment. So these are the three primary principles of reproductive justice. And I think that when we bring that to economics, this is the sentence that summarizes it for me. An economic analysis of reproductive justice requires understanding people's intersectional identities in the context of a stratified society and their varying degrees of access to agency and voice when making reproductive decisions for themselves, their communities, and provision decisions for their children. Which hopefully in this room resonates with what we think that economic science should be and should look like. With that in mind, I think that it's very obvious that under capitalism, the right to be a parent, to become a parent, and to provide a healthy and safe space for your children is increasingly a class privilege. Who can afford kids, bro? Seriously. And you don't have to be a heterodox economist to know that. I have here just some data from, Israel, Denmark, United States, and showing that the birth of the first child not only generates a significant motherhood penalty, which we measure both in terms of earnings, but also in terms of labor market participation. There's also evidence that it generates a fatherhood bonus. So when we control for all the variables in the very non-Bayesian econometrics that is prevalent in our science, we see that men make more money from having children because there is the stereotype that now they have a family to take care of, that they're going to take their jobs more seriously, and they're now this provider. And this is very well documented in mainstream science. We literally had someone winning the Nobel Prize in economics, the quasi-Nobel Prize that economics has, talking about this. And you cannot be more mainstream than actually winning the Nobel Prize, right? So you don't have to be a heterodox economist to understand that this is true. But I argue, and people more important than me also argue, that you have to be a heterodox economist and a feminist economist to understand the underlying structures of capitalism that allow this to be a featured characteristics of this mode of production, and to come up with solutions for us to overcome the care crisis that it's embedded in this system. So some of the consequences of this kidnapping of people's right to choose to raise a healthy and happy family, I outlined in here with this very funny comic book. First of all, there is this creation of a hierarchy of mothers and who is suited and fitted to actually become a mother and who is not. And don't get me wrong, In the society that we live in, if you're a mother, you're always doing something wrong, and someone is always going to call your attention to. But in general, they're going to do that by pointing out other women that are better than you at being a mom. There is, and that's also very clear in mainstream literature, a sharp inequality in investment per child, because people delay parenthood, have less, decrease the sizes of their families, and they just come up with different ways to try to provide. But with increasing inequality and decreasing fertility, we have a sharp inequality in terms of how much investment you can put in a children, not only in terms of money, which is how economists in general think about investment, but also in terms of time, of how much time and how much dedication you can spend with your children. And then also feeding a little bit from the previous presentation, Paolo mentioned how the mainstream statistical tools that are used in economics have a good deal of eugenics embedded in them, that it's individual characteristics, individual observable characteristics that explain certain outcomes. And the conservatives or the right-wing movements or the economists that try to be, good people, the clean ones, the ones who barely hang out with the fascists, they try to convince us of this argument of, it's not that I'm racist, it's not that I want black women not to have kids, it's just that they are poor and it's going to be so bad because they're not going to be able to invest in their children. It's not that I believe that immigrants shouldn't have kids, it's just that they're in these impoverished communities, so it would be great if you can just not have kids ever and hopefully get out of here, as per the recent elections, right? And so you have this eugenics discourse masked or hidden behind this material conditions story, And in the current phase of capitalism, in what I call the neoliberal phase of capitalism, the public provision of care, and you can think of public schools, public hospitals, care facilities, child care, all of those structures are being dismantled, and it's a very coordinated and intentional project to basically dismantle all of those structures of care. And so care becomes more privatized, care becomes even more provided at the household level, and it historically means that it's going to be underpaid women and unpaid women who are going to have to provide when there are no collective structures that can do so. Whenever we talk about care, and this is also giving some more tangible thoughts on why mainstream economists don't have the correct tools to analyze this type of care services and markets. Care is a very unique sector, and care services are very, very unique. Mainstream economists tend to, take whichever market and just say oh, you want to buy an apple, or you substitute an apple with a banana. And it's basically the same for people. You're going to hire a worker, or you're going to hire this other worker. And care specifically has so many characteristics that you just cannot compare care services with apples or oranges. And specifically, when we have care provision that it's oriented for a profit-maximizing firm, there are a lot of intuitive and applied work that shows that markets are horrible providers of care. And if any of you ever saw, either from personal experience or the research that shows us that facilities that take care of the elderly, for-profit facilities, are horrible and inhumane. And I'm not saying that the public and not-for-profit ones are amazing, but they are significantly better. And every time that you have for-profit motives and quantifying profit outcomes, you tend to increase, student per teacher ratios or student care recipient to caretaker ratios, and all of those things that we know that make care worse. But by how much? This is the type of questions that mainstream economics cannot answer. And these are the right questions to ask. These are the questions that make us better off, that actually provide well-being for an economy. And this tends to also generate, and this is where people mostly focus when they talk about a care crisis, a declining labor force participation rate, because people are not having kids, so we are having an increasing share of the population that it's retired or elderly. But also, and talking specifically about the United States, it's the only country, OECD country, that has declining labor force participation for women in the last decade. And the number one reason for women to drop out of the labor market when they are prime age, between 25 and 54, is because they're taking care of someone else. And for men, which is a global trend, labor force participation rates for men are decreasing basically everywhere, but they're decreasing fast in the United States. And the number one reason for that is illness and disability. So we are not taking care of our people. This has to do with this great contradiction of capitalism, and this is the reason why in feminist economics and in certain schools, here I'm quoting how the social reproduction theory frames the question. If workers produce all value, who produce the workers? And so there is this inherent contradiction of capitalism needing to exploit women and their own labor power directly, so they have to go to get labor work in the market, but indirectly they also have to take care of the workers, so they have to provide underpaid or unpaid services so that everyone else's labor power can be sold in the market. So we have healthy and happy workers that wake up in the morning and go to work, who are healthy and fat and all of that. So this care crisis that it's so evident right now under neoliberal capitalism is fundamentally embedded in how the system works. And so far, the solutions that contemporary capitalism has come up with, first of all, is marketization and mechanization of the care services, and you can think of a whole bunch of them, including colonizing other people's bodies. So you think of the Kardashian who hires another brown woman to carry her baby for her. You can think of all of the machines that we have in our home to do our laundry and do our dishes, and the little robot that cleans the floor. Whatever, and they decrease the burden, so they do deal a little bit with the time poverty issue, but when we start using those solutions to personal care and direct type of care, there is a good argument that it actually impacts the quality of the care that is being provided. And us finding community and us getting together has a lot to do with our sense of selves and the culture that we carry, and who we are, and what is our community. And whenever we get rid of those things, we lose an important sense of well-being. It also accentuates the exploitation of oppressed populations. So there's all of this south-north migration, especially of women who come to countries in the global north to be caretakers. In the US, there's a specific type of visa for au pairs specifically, and you gotta be a young woman who's gonna take care of other kids. And they provide a visa for that, because there's this gigantic need of people who are gonna do it for very, very little money. You have an increasing exploitation of women of color specifically, and this also has some other intersectionalities with gay men and trans individuals who are also seen as this lower class type of workers. And you do see this rising of this reactionary and patriarchal values, like the treadwife kind of new trend, as something that is going to solve the problem in some other people's minds. Because this is an economics conference, I decided to add a last-minute slide that is going to make me go above time, but probabilistic analysis told me that this was going to be full of men. So I had a slide called What About Men? Because I've heard before, oh, it's just that men are, taking more care of their kids, and that then there's this, dismantling of these values, and we are moving forward. And there's a lot of data that tells us that that's actually not true. It might be true in very small circles of very privileged people that are mostly white and have higher education, which is a lot of the circles that we all talk to. But statistically, that's really not true. And even when men are out of the labor force, they spend more time sleeping and watching TV and socializing and just a teeny tiny bit more time doing household activities and childcare. So this is what I had, and this is a capybara, something that the south of South America provides to the world that it's really nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very sadly missed yesterday, but I did notice the gender division of intellectual labor along thematic lines. Maybe we can all discuss that later. Number 2 up, we have Sirisha Naidu, who is an associate professor of economics and affiliate faculty in the Department of Race, Ethnic, and Gender Studies at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Her research focuses on feminist political economy analyses of agrarian change and ecological shifts, environmental justice, the interwoven tapestry of productive and reproductive labor in the global south, and informal and precarious work in the global economy. In addition to her academic roles, Sirisha is producer and co-host of the radio show Economics for the People on KKFI 90.1 FM. Awesome, thank you.
While I'm pulling up the slides, I want to thank Clara, Bruno, and Scott for this, and Jisoo for putting it all together, but particularly that it's in the Midwest. UMKC, for those of you who don't know, is about a 4-hour drive. And I know that from my student population that there's this desire to engage in heterodox economics, not because it's somehow different, but it somehow speaks to the lives of people, and to have another center so close to us and to be able to hopefully interact more would be fabulous. So thank you, thank you. Okay, so I have a lot of ground to cover, and I hope I don't go over time. But I want to reiterate, in this final panel of this conference, we now get to this conversation about the existential threat that capitalism poses to humanity, right? And all of life as we know it. So my research, what it tries to do is, it tries to understand the material conditions of the working classes, not just as a way to understand, but also because it also suggests the conditions for struggle, for change, for transformation, and perhaps revolution. But the focus of my presentation is not a capitalist crisis, because sometimes when we talk about climate, we often talk about it as a capitalist crisis, but another ongoing crisis which has received much less attention, even among heterodox economists, and that is the crisis of social reproduction, which is a crisis that's facing the working classes. And it's not a new crisis, it's been going on for a very long time, particularly for the working classes in the global south. And I will argue that our current conjuncture may best be understood through the lens of Marxist feminist political economy. And I want to preface this presentation with 2 disclaimers. One, I use the terms ecology, environment, and nature interchangeably. I know there was at least one other person who was an ecologist. I apologize in advance. And then second, when I talk about social reproduction, I'm particularly talking about social reproduction of the working classes. I'm not really thinking about how others are kind of reproducing themselves, right? So here's this, climate change and, all sorts of environmental crises. I don't know why this is not showing up, but, it's actually... Right, yeah. It's still not, okay, but essentially it's like workers in the cobalt mines. Anyway, so it's presented as an external shock, separate from economic issues, and of course that's not the case. We know that, these, and I'm going to argue that it actually represents an acute crisis of social reproduction and that it's an integral to class struggle. And I have these 2 slides up just to show you that there is actually a literature in which this research is located, but I don't have time to get into it. So if anyone's interested, we'll talk about it. And I also want to, in terms of social reproduction, just, what is it? It's a daily and generational reproduction of labor power or human life under capitalism. And the definition that I use doesn't separate this daily and generational reproduction from societal reproduction, can get into all of that later on. But I also want to acknowledge the literature in social reproduction itself, and also Sue Ferguson, who is one of the people responsible for social reproduction theory, who's sitting in the audience. But I locate my work, in a different kind of tradition within social reproduction, talking about, heterodox approaches and diversity. So even within this social reproduction approaches, there are all of these debates and discussions that we've been having. And the distinction being that within the sort of approach that I locate myself in, I'm not making a distinction between productive and reproductive sphere, and I'll talk about this, and also not making a distinction between the control of capital, which sometimes, among other social reproduction theorists, the assumption is that the control of capital doesn't extend into the household sphere. So I'm not, that's not what I am, so I don't, I do believe it does extend over the household sphere and the means of production and reproduction. What I want to do, though, is get to very quickly just, how useful are these binaries, right? So when we talk about the household, it's often associated with the private sphere that primarily engages in this reproductive labor, which is unpaid work. Right? And the workplace, on the other hand, is the public sphere that engages in quote-unquote productive work that is productive labor that is paid work. So this demarcation, these binaries, I don't find them to be very useful. They're analytically useful to understand how capitalism views work and labor. But I argue in a recent paper that, or a chapter in a book, that it doesn't offer us an understanding of the working classes, and it only, these binaries only offer us an understanding through the framework of surplus accumulation, and so they impede our understanding of how working classes navigate capitalism across space and time. And how we understand these categories impacts how we understand the lives of working people, sort of what are the narratives that we as economists are offering, and hopefully we're not offering this without consulting, without, in conjunction with the people we're writing about, but it also has implications for policy making, it has implications for our popular understanding, and it impacts our political imagination for, resistance and liberation. So, that's, I want to preface that. So let me come to this. This is there were actually, in the paper, which is actually a paper got published in 2023, there are some equations which I have not included, and I hope some of you will at least thank me for this. But it's essentially, Titi Bhattacharya had offered a circuit of social reproduction in her 2017 work, and this is an extension of it, both as a critique but also an extension, right? Because Bhattacharya's work focuses on wage work, and I want to, I want to expand it, particularly to incorporate all of the different labor processes that people, women and other people in the global south engage in. And I want to acknowledge that this framework really comes from, or has been sort of inspired by a series of papers on India and Southern Africa that I co-wrote with Lynn Osome from the Makerere Institute of Social Research in Uganda. So the first circuit is, the circuit of wage labor. It's a traditional site of class struggle, and the reason why there are multiple circuits, this is sort of a modest kind of attempt to try and re-theorize or reconceptualize how we think about work, and particularly what is quote-unquote called reproductive work, is that particularly in the global south, this first circuit, which is the wage work, doesn't actually satisfy necessary consumption. So, we have this second circuit, and the second and the third circuit, which relies on non-waged work or non-waged labor, right? And again, paucity of time, I'm not going to go into detailed explanation, but essentially, this non-waged work or non-waged labor engages in commodity production of various forms, whether it's petty commodity production or you want to talk about it as formal subsumption, all sorts of things, right? And as we experience the decline of state support for socialized provisioning, even in the global north, we observe the working classes in the US and elsewhere engaging in all sorts of multiple jobs, across fragmented spaces, right? So this kind of glorification of the side job, the side hustle, right? And it's sort of, anyway. So, and then the third circuit is using all of this non-wage labor to produce goods and services, right? And this is what is typically referred to as, again, quote-unquote, reproductive labor, but it's often, from the literature in feminist economics, it's often reduced to care, right? And there is all this debate about, should it be called care, reproductive, etc. But here's the thing, in the global south perspective, or in the global south experience, reproductive labor is not just care. People engage in subsistence production. This means that collecting water and firewood, and sometimes it's backbreaking literally, and it's long hours and so on, and it's historically performed by women, right? So you have these three circuits, and the sum total of all these labors is the total workday, right? And what I call the labors of social reproduction. So when working people, and in India, Southern Africa, parts of Latin America, I imagine, and because there's this rich literature of informal work coming from Latin America, often engage in a cornucopia of these different labor processes. Sometimes it's different people in a household, or it's one person engaging in different labor processes, and that then represents a lengthening of the total workday. Right, and this is, and in a 2016 paper, Lynn Osome and I called this a survivalist strategy and not a pathway out of poverty, because livelihood studies that come from, development studies were thinking of it as perhaps, maybe this is a pathway out of poverty, and we kind of, we argue that's not, right? So even though working women are likely to be subject to this lengthening, working class men are not exempt from it either. So as much as, the literature on social reproduction tries to talk about women and men and gendered labor, and this is also where I kind of look at my work, I think the social reproduction framework actually allows us to think about it much more generally as working people, and what does it mean to actually socially reproduce yourself. And that means that you are engaging in wage labor, not because it's fun and because you want capitalists to make money. You are doing it because it's part of a household strategy to ensure that the household survives, right? So for me, wage labor is not separate from social reproduction. It's this collection of, so it's part of the labors of social reproduction. So where does the crisis come in, right? Because, we can think about the care crisis that, again, in terms of the literature from the global north, says that the care crisis is when some of that wage work, the commodified goods in production gets shifted to the non-waged work, and that's a care crisis. You don't have enough people to take care of you. But really, I'm arguing, or I argue in this paper, that when you have, so that may be a crisis of social reproduction, but when the combined efforts of the labors of social reproduction are insufficient to meet necessary consumption, then people are experiencing conditions of immiseration or an acute crisis of social reproduction, right? And so state intervention has not been historically in the global south been sufficient to meet this crisis, right? So you can think of the ecology of capitalism has always represented, or not always, but in many parts of the world, has represented an acute crisis for some populations of the world. You can think about the AIDS crisis in South Africa, malnutrition in large parts of Africa and South Asia, the cholera pandemic, which, continues, but, is, and then, not having access to basic sanitation, water, etc., and famines in Yemen, etc., right? So, in any case, so where does nature come into it, and where does climate crisis come into it? So, in order to engage in any of these labors of social reproduction, particularly for non-wage production, a lot of people rely on nature in some way or the other, right? And this might be true, and this is true even in the global north, where someone mentioned and I can't remember who, someone mentioned in the panel on, I think it might have been David McNally, but talking about, the working classes were never fully devoid of the means of reproduction, right? So you do need air and water to reproduce yourself, and that may not be commodified, right? It is still not commodified or entirely in the US, right? So loss of nature through climate disasters, ecological degradations, and other attempts to exclude people for development and conservation involves an increase in the labors of social reproduction. And there is work that's been done on this. I've done some work in the Indian Himalayas, but it could also mean that there is an increased effort required when your air quality is low and the people you take care of need care, right? And this expenditure of labor is typically gendered. Now, beyond this, there are other aspects of human life that we economists fail to account for: the value of green spaces, relationship between humans and nature that Tiago, our comrade from MST, talked about yesterday. So the value of land is not just in terms of its productive value. The value of land goes beyond that. And in talking about land, and because we're not just talking about the productive land, I mean everything that encompasses the natural commons and, people who, anyway. So it is in capital's interest to then influence the working classes to adopt consumption levels and patterns that not only mitigate the crises of social reproduction for capital, which is different from the crises of social reproduction for labor, but are also adopt consumption patterns that are most conducive to surplus generation. So even by historical accounts, capital has employed economic, legal, extra-legal, ideological mechanisms to influence this, consumption, right? Because it's socially determined, right? So E.P. Thompson has written about the regular dietary class war. Tariq Ali writes about how religious poems were used in India to kind of convincing or trying to convince peasants to reduce their consumption. And then, of course, in India, caste ideologies continue to impose limits on how much what people can aspire to, what they can consume, and so on, right? And then Clara Branks, in her presentation, I don't know, had this thing, right, where the Bank of England said people should just accept they're poor, right? I mean, what is that, trying to influence consumption levels, right? So in the half a minute or 1 minute I have left, I want to talk about, that this crisis of social reproduction for working people under capitalism, it stretches the amount of energy that is expended in different labor processes. Something that we want to identify what these processes are, what these labor processes are, and what these nodes are in order to identify both spaces of surplus extraction, but also potential sites of resistance. And in terms of, is social reproduction central to radical political economy? I am biased towards saying yes. But for most of this conference, we've been discussing structural macro conditions, and of course they're important. But the work of Marxist feminist economists and the work of Black feminist economists, people who have been writing about sort of ways in which working class people have tried to navigate capitalism, right? So I'm thinking about the work of Caroline Shehnaz Hussain, Nina Banks, Jessica Gordon-Nemhart, others writing about community economies influenced by Julie Graham and Catherine Gibson. These are some voices that are not here at the conference, but they remind us why radical political economics needs analyses of macro conditions, but they also need analyses of material conditions of life and struggle. Right? So if we talk about how do we influence, what influence can heterodox economics have, we need to combine both, and it's by engaging both that we can identify contradictions in the system, but we can also formulate strategies and tactics, not for reform, as Stephen talked about, but for transformation. And I'll end there.
Thank you. Awesome. Luiza, you going next? just fantastic. Next, we have Luiza Pires, I hope I pronounced that right, who is the co-director of MADE and assistant professor at the Institute of Economics at UNICAMP. She holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research, go the New School, and is a research associate in the Gender Equality and Economics program at the Levy Economics Institute at Bard, where she lectured in the graduate programs in economic theory and public policy. She is also the representative of the Caucus of Women and Non-Binary People in the steering committee of URPE and a member of the board of directors of IAFFE. Thank you, Luiza.
Okay, I have no slides, so maybe I'll just get that so I don't get distracted. What do I don't know where the main one went, but anyways. I'll start by thanking Clara so much for inviting me, and for Scott and Bruno for also hosting, and especially for Jisoo for all the amazing work she's done. I'm very impressed by how well organized this was and how easy it was to get here. So thank you so much, everyone. It's a very tough crowd to follow. Oh my God, I'm a little nervous, but let's try. So I have been, for the last few years, I'm constantly being forced to put this climate and, care dimension or social dimension in general together. It's very difficult. So I'm a feminist economist, which already means that I need to discuss many, many matters. Like a feminist economist ends up being someone that, like, I teach microeconomics, but everyone sees me as a macroeconomist for some reason. I'm writing mostly on policy, applied work in Brazil. And one of the main obstacles we have today is that people are trying to think of this just transition. In policy terms, it really means trying to think of how we can come up with solutions for the climate crisis that are not increasing inequality, and of course that still brings about growth. We never give up on that. So the problem is that more frequently than we would like, there are contradictory goals between feminism, economics, and sustainable development, especially if you're not evaluating a national policy for the US or an European country. So I want to focus today on economic policy responses to those crises, comparing a little bit these possibilities, the possibility of solutions for countries like the US or European countries, to the case of Brazil, where I do most work on the hope that the case of Brazil does shed some light also on other countries, even though Brazil is quite privileged in some terms when it comes to Global South countries. And I think this has been a little mentioned already in other sessions. So I'll start by very briefly talking about how I see the care and the climate crisis, but mostly my view align a lot with that of Sirisha and Debora, so that already helps me a little bit. But just to recapture, I see care crisis and climate crisis as both intrinsic to capitalism. The process of accumulation itself creates an incentive to expropriate people of their labor, like in the case of unpaid reproductive work, and to expropriate nature. So this is the consequence of reproductive and nature spheres not being considered in the productive sphere, as Sirisha already mentioned. And one expression of that, which I think is important when we're talking about policy, is the fact that neither impacts to natural resources nor unpaid care work are accounted for in GDP. So our macroeconomic policies tend to disregard and intensify those. So in macroeconomic modeling terms, this means that you are really trying to solve a three-dimensional problem, where those dimensions are treated as separate ones. So we are trying to come up with policies that are combating inequalities and show that they deliver growth without increasing carbon emissions. This is one basic setup. We're not trying to, so for example, one of the traits of being a feminist economist that I like to explain is that I am not a gender economist in the sense that I'm not here trying to show that gender equality will bring about growth. My end goal is gender equality, and this is very different. So as a consequence, we have very few economists today even trying to attempt to work on climate and care at the same time. We do have some environmental economists that will mostly analyze how certain green policies can bring about growth and then go for those or argue for those, and gender economists or feminist economists showing how, and then I'm going to give you one very specific example, invest in care can create jobs and benefit the economy as a whole. Even assuming that there are few solutions within our system to the care crisis or solutions to the climate crisis that still bring about growth, not accounting for the two of them at the same time will be a problem. And one reason is because the care and climate dimensions reinforce each other, and I think also Sirisha already did a very good job with that. But again, to cite a few, the climate change will impact access to resources such as water, food, will increase illness, damage physical and social care infrastructure. Climate disasters have been impacting mostly vulnerable communities already extremely burdened by care responsibilities, so climate crisis is increasing care crisis. And at the same time, we have the fact that climate resilient practices require intensive labor, and I think that Sirisha did much better than me, like really thinking of those as the same. I'm not even separating care and climate, but organic agriculture, recycling, composting, to cite a few more common to the U.S. Context. So the care crisis affect also women's ability to care for nature, and we see a decrease in reforestation, land rehabilitation, waste management practices, and so on. So when you don't think of those two dimensions together, and when making policy recommendations, we're really not being that rigorous. And things are going to get even more complicated if we acknowledge that most people are only considering the impacts of their policies within their countries. And both of those crises are global. There are innumerous contradictions between, for example, growth in the US and racial equality in the global South. So even the most progressive economists keep trying to run models, hoping that the results will be that increasing gender or racial equality will bring about sustainable growth. But what if it doesn't? What if gender equality does bring growth to the global North, but only at the cost of even more inequality in the global South? Or what if the best strategy for the global North to build greener and gender-equal national economies is to renew colonial relations? So I have been begging to those running models for their developed countries not to exclude from their analysis the impacts that certain policies will have on women across the world. That's not appropriate work in the traditions of political economy. To be a feminist political economist is to bring to light such intrinsic contradictions of the economics discipline and draw conclusions from that. Any Latin American macroeconomists need to understand how the rest of the world interact with their economies. It is an European and a US privilege to ignore the rest of the world. You can't count carbons within the borders, and you can't count carbons without considering their social impact around the globe. So let's talk a little bit about policy recommendations to climate and care. And I'll start with care. The standard solution given to care has been to invest in care infrastructure, so basically shift to the state part of the care responsibilities. It is a very sound solution accepted by feminists and world bankers alike. When you invest in care infrastructure, you relieve the care burden, you create jobs in a highly feminized sector, which means that you are increasing the demand for female labor, which also increases women's income. And on top of that, care sectors are labor intensive and have very high multiplier effects, especially when compared to physical infrastructure sectors. So this is a classical example of a gender-sensitive policy that also delivers growth. So we know very well already how to sell those policies to finance ministers. It's not that hard, and you do not need to talk to them about social justice. You can only talk to them, you could talk to them about just the economic advantages of those policies. And this has worked well in many countries, and it might work well in European countries with no fiscal constraint. It could work in the US if there was political will. I'm not going to get on that page because that's a little more complicated. But it certainly does not work for a country like Brazil. There were some people have talked about Brazil before, but I'm gonna look at it from the taxation perspective only and not go so much into the spending part of fiscal rules. I think Clara already talked a little bit about that yesterday. So look at it this way. 50% of the income in Brazil is in the hands of the top 10%. the percentage of our population making more than minimum wage is very low. High GDP per capita and lower inequality means that you have a much larger base of population that can be taxed. So one of the traits of Latin American countries has been that our tax revenue comes mostly from indirect taxes. We've been really called upon that. But it's an extremely difficult figure to change. We can't really increase who we're taxing. Politically speaking, increasing taxes at the top is super difficult. This is what we've been pushing for. But this means that there is also a constraint on our capacity of getting more tax revenues. Add that to the fact that we have austerity and people are cutting spending and are really looking to the deficit, it becomes very difficult to push for more services to be provided. We are actually, right now, we are defending the ones we already have. So the other thing I want to mention is that so take the case of the US or an European country, the high GDP per capita and low inequality, I mean, more in Europe so than in the US, but still compared to Brazil, US is not that unequal. That is determinant for these countries to be able to raise enough revenues to sustain a welfare state. And that cannot be dissociated from the inequality and poverty in other countries. Continuous colonialist relationships cannot be disregarded here. So this doesn't only mean that a country like Brazil cannot have an European welfare state. It means that the European welfare state comes at the cost of exploitation of African and Latin American countries. Around the globe, the care crisis is being solved for some women at the cost of many. The state solution is one of those cases. But also in Brazil, what we have is that nearly 1/5 of employed black women are domestic workers. They represent 61% of individuals and 67% of the women employed in that sector. They are paid less than minimum wage. They have a 75% informality rate, which is twice the average in the country. And only 30% of them have pension plans, which means that when they retire, well, they're not retired, so they will take care of people their whole lives and they will not be cared for when they age. And so basically in Brazil, what happened is that we have an army of informal precarized workers providing an essential service for other people, and mostly women, to participate in the labor market. Racism and sexism have been the solutions to the care crisis in Brazil. I don't know how I'm doing with time. So one example, sorry? Okay, yeah, so one example of this is in 2016, there was passed the law that finally made domestic workers workers in Brazil. So up to 2016, domestic workers were not allowed to be seen as workers. They could not be formal workers. We have labor laws that apply to workers in general. They could not apply to them. Our labor laws date from 1943. They only became seen as workers in 2016. There was a huge backlash from middle class and white women around the country on this issue. So what happens is the fact that we are counting on racism to solve our care crisis, this is a way of dividing women between black and white women. So it's really hard to have a feminist movement that is coherent if racism is on the basis of solving this crisis. And you can see the same for citizens and migrant women in the US, and in general, privileged women and vulnerable women all around the world. So there has also been a tendency for us to ignore the care crisis as racial capitalism has given a solution to it, and focus on the climate crisis, which has created a great opportunity for capitalism to reinvent itself and renew those colonial relations. So we're just entering a new phase of the same old racialized capitalism in the way that policies for the climate have been put together for now. So turning to those common climate crisis solutions that are being given on the global north, mostly they are addressing climate crisis as an energy crisis. So US and European countries are very focused on mitigation and coming up with some unsatisfying solutions such as renewable energies, electric cars, and so on. Meanwhile, for example, in the case of Brazil, the food consumption that around the world that is kind of incentivizes deforestation in many countries is one of the many reasons why Brazil has a lot of deforestation. And 67% of emissions in Brazil come from deforestation. We do not have an energy crisis. So our mitigation efforts cannot go onto energy. Our mitigation efforts needs to go towards deforestation. And also it will not be solved by solutions such as electric cars. Electric cars are, though, a great solution for profit accumulation. They renew extractivist relations between central and peripheral economies. So, taking from the perspective of a country like Brazil, mitigation efforts need to focus on stopping deforestation, and we need to already understand that we are being affected by the climate crisis. One example is the case of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, who was flooded last year. So we really need to start shifting focus from mitigation policies to adaptation policies and put in place emergency reserves. On the fiscal context we have, this that is shaped by austerity, this poses even more obstacles. So I'm running out of time, I guess. I just want to end by speaking up to what I think a center like CHE can do when it's doing its research, because I think this was a question also by Clara on the very first panel. So I think the first thing I want to say is that I would like Globe Norfolk scholars to be extremely aware of the impact that their scholarship has on Global South. I don't think you know that. So we live in the age of evidence-based public policy. I think last panel already did a great job on creating problems to that idea. So we need to be responsible for how we produce what is regarded as this evidence. One example of this that has not to do with the methodologies we use is that an empirical paper using US data or OECD data is a case study. It's not a general case, and it is published everywhere as if, like the titles of it, it's sold as if when you have your US data, you're actually talking about how to solve a problem for the world. It's not like that. It is obvious, but you have no idea how much energy, for example, we need to put in Brazil to try to deconstruct this feeling that what we need is electric cars. This is one example of it. And finally, what we need from Global North scholars is not just to echo our work, but actually to dispute the policies being made in the Global North, accounting for the effect it will have on us. So, for example, when the US overreacts to inflation by increasing their interest rate, you're not only increasing inequality in the US, you are impacting other countries' inflation. Or, as already mentioned, you incentivizing the production and consumption of electric cars means more assertivism in Latin America. You can come up with that research. You don't need Global South scholars to be doing that research. That is feasible here as well. Finally, all of us have privilege in some way from this current system, and that includes absolutely everyone here, even if many more, much more than others. And we need to acknowledge that. So a heterodox economist cannot avoid complex themes, and we cannot be afraid to point out those contradictions, not even personal contradictions, even if that makes us uncomfortable and incoherent sometimes. It is by resolving those contradictions that we'll reach change, and I think Sirisha ended kind of on the same note, which I really like. So if our research does not take as a departure point the fact that we are profiting from racialized colonial relations, it will only come up with solutions to our current crisis that are either useless or, in the best case scenario, or that will reinforce those racialized colonial relations. Thank you.
Amazing. I love this panel. And we have one final speaker, and then I will open the floor for questions, and we should have quite a lot of time for discussion, questions and interventions. So finally, very happy to bring up Anamary Linares, who holds a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is assistant professor of economics and society stream in the Department of Economics at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg. Her research areas lie at the intersection of feminist political economy, labor, development and distribution in the global south countries, especially Cuba. She is particularly interested in social reproduction approaches at different levels of analysis, from theoretical to methodological to empirical. Her current research aims to contribute to a better understanding of the circumstances and processes of state involvement in social reproduction processes and their unequal implications for the distribution of the costs of social reproduction among the state, the market, families, and communities in Global South contexts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm literally the last speaker, so please bear with me. So I want to join everyone else in my colleagues and other speakers to thank Clara for inviting me, and also congratulate Clara and Bruno and Jisoo and Scott for organizing this amazing event, and of course for putting in motion this project. I wish the project the success that it's deserved, and also I hope that it can inspire and help disseminate similar initiatives across the US and across the globe. So I'm going to change gears a little bit in our discussion. And my presentation, I have titled some Crisis of Social Reproduction and the Urgency of Renegotiating the Reproductive Bargain in Cuba, particularly, and hopefully I will discuss some policy implications. So I would like to start by stating that many scholars in the social reproduction tradition, that thanks my colleagues for advancing the main insights within feminist political economy and particularly social reproduction theory, emphasizes that the social analysis that these perspectives provide offer also a path for a transformative agenda towards a post-capitalist future. However, the theoretical references to how social reproduction theory in particular would be or already has been developed in non-capitalist or socialist economies are sparse. So the different scholars like Harun Jafi, for example, argues that an account of social reproduction on non-capitalist societies would require a totally different notion of value. So this kind of underdevelopment of theories of post-capitalist social reproduction is related, I think, on one hand to the dearth of alternative models of social reproduction in concrete historical experiences. And on the other hand, I think it's also related to a sort of relative consensus, I would say, among different scholars within the social reproduction tradition that past and current self-denominated socialist countries were never and are not actually socialist. So they argue that a necessary condition in a post-capitalist society that the producers of the surplus will determine its production and distribution has not been met, a condition that I agree with. However, I believe that social reproduction frameworks are not only extremely relevant, but crucial to understand and study contemporary non-capitalist experiences, such as Cuba. And I leave it like very broadly non-capitalist on purpose. I'm happy to discuss after. So part of the Heterox project, I think, should be precisely discussing and learning from these alternative experiences, not idealizing them or in a kind of romantic way, but critically thinking about their conditions of possibilities, their failures, their success, and therefore what can be learned to move forward. So then I would like to share with you today two generalized ideas using the Cuban context, not the Cuban case, so thanks Luiza for that. But I think that the relevance of this might transcend also the Cuban context. And discuss some of the implications. And to do so, I will rely on insights from social reproduction approaches within feminist political economy And the concept of the reproductive bargain, as elaborated by Ruth Pearson, Professor Emerita of Development Studies at Leeds University back in the 90s, because I think it's a framework that provides a way to integrate the potential contribution of the state in the reproduction of workers and labor power over the life course, something that I think that the project of social reproduction and social reproduction theory needs to be, to develop further in that engagement with questions related to the state and how the state is involved in social reproduction processes. So the first idea is that for the Cuban context, I think that there is an urgency to think and phrase and tackle the Cuban crisis of social reproduction as such. Right? Has a crisis of social reproduction. So, esto está en candela, esto no da más. So those are phrases, this is on flames, the well has dried up. So those are probably inaccurate translations, but those are common phrases in Cuban everyday lives today, in which we experience the worst crisis after the revolutionary period, even worse than the crisis of the 90s after the demise of the Soviet Union. So that word crisis is one of the most frequently spoken words right now in Cuba since 2020, and probably also one of the things that people are listen to the most. So in Cuba, all the analysis and the scholarship of the crisis aftermath back in the 90s and after the demise of the Soviet Union, and also now after the COVID-19 pandemic, have privileged and also the analysis of the subsequent reforms that have been taking place, have privileged a production and consumption approach. So there are very few contributions that tackle the crisis from a social reproduction perspective, but neither the crisis of the 90s nor the current crisis are merely a crisis of production, but social reproduction. So what does that mean in the Cuban context? A social reproduction crisis implies a multidimensional crisis in which the care crisis, as Emma Gowin defines, that a growing gap between care needs and the resources of all kinds that are made available to them is at the center, but it's not the only dimension. There are other strands, economic, ecological, political, that are also present, overlapping and exacerbating with one another. So none are accidental, as Nancy Fraser has put it, but has a deep systemic roots, quoting, in the structure of our social order, unquote. So in the Cuban case, I think there is a very accurate and painful description of what a social reproduction crisis means right now, done by the French sociologist Blandine d'Estremont, in which she says that the social reproduction crisis is displayed also as a crisis of time, and quoting, manifested by the hypertrophy of time required for daily survival to the detriment of productive work and personal time, by biographical and intergenerational ruptures, in particular migrations, and by a generalized incapacity to project oneself into an increasingly uncertain future, unquote. So understanding the social reproduction crisis in Cuba entails recognizing that who provides what, and under which conditions, will entail not only a short-term adjustment to the crisis context in terms of we have to increase GDP, we have to balance our fiscal accounts and all of that. That's important, of course, but it also entails a longer restructuring of the social reproductive contract or reproductive bargain between the state and the citizenship. And that has permanent consequences for the whole project of Cuba, of the Cuban project, and for also the meanings of the revolution. So the productive bargain, as elaborated by Ruth Pearson, refers specifically to the ways in which goods and services for reproduction, in the widest sense, are provided and were provided in the 90s and are still provided today in Cuba, which can also be understood as a way to ensure the continuity of the social and human aspects of reproduction between the state and the population. So, in other words, it refers to all the set of social arrangements regarding how the distribution of the cost of social reproduction have been and will be among the different social actors or sites of social reproduction, if you prefer, the state, the family, the market, and the community, and what those arrangements imply. So I argue that the reproductive bargain can be renegotiated implicitly or explicitly. So implicitly implies the ways in which, as a response to the crisis, The responsibilities and strategies of the different actors modify, but following more a sort of a survival instinct. An explicit renegotiation would imply a transformation of the legal framework, the discourse, and the public policy implementation, although not necessarily in any specific order or at the same time, and often also in contradictory ways. So, and this takes us then to the second idea. So, and the second idea is that Cuba needs to renegotiate the reproductive bargain, has a precondition for a meaningful, comprehensive reform that can serve as a starting point for a more durable recovery path. And let me elaborate in this point as quickly as possible. So since 2010, with the reforms of Raúl Castro's government, Cuba is experiencing some of the key features of what is called the reprivatization of social reproduction, as Baker and Gill defined them, which involves three main aspects. One, a shift of the burden of social reproduction to the private domain, the family, with the corresponding gender consequences. Second, an increasing commodification or marketization, if we want, both in formal and informal networks. Let's not think about, markets and privatization in the neoliberal way as we know it in the global north, but actually in very different arrangements in the informal sectors and the ways in which people, participate in the exchange processes. So, but there has been that marketization of daily and social reproduction processes that were previously socialized, or as I prefer to call it, statized, because socialization and statization is not the same. And third is retreat or withdrawal of the state from some of its social reproduction responsibilities. And I'll can talk a little bit more about the role of the state in social reproduction maybe in the Q&A, which is not limited, by the way, to the role as social provisioner. So I think this is relevant because the privatization of social reproduction and the social reproduction crisis go often hand by hand. So during these processes, the cost of social reproduction between the state, the market, the family, and the communities change, with unequal consequences for different groups. And that's very visible in the current Cuban context, in which inequalities have been rising, even if we don't have data to measure them. So we can say that a kind of explicit renegotiation of the reproductive bargain started in the 2010 reforms, but the official discourse has been very ambivalent and contradictory toward recognizing this, including the current, the actual government of Miguel Díaz-Canel. So economic stress, so low levels of economic growth is one very important reason, but it's not the only one. There are other factors that also undermine, quoting Harkonnen, undermine the structures of care the state claims to provide. So a heavy bureaucracy, for example, inflexible state regulations that prevent people's efforts to do their share in sustaining themselves in a precarious economic environment in a context in which the previous reproductive bargain, in which daily reproduction was ensured through a combination of wage work, especially in predominantly state-owned enterprises, social consumption funds, direct entitlements through state provisions of goods and services, and unpaid care and domestic labor, this one unrecognized, is no longer in place. So I claim that the reluctance of the government to acknowledge the need to renegotiate the social reproductive bargain is problematic and make a case for the urgency of such a renegotiation, which cannot take at this point explicitly or exclusively within national boundaries, but need to include the diaspora necessarily. So the reluctance of that recognition, of officially recognize that there has been a change in the ways in which goods and services are negotiated between the state and the citizenship, that reluctance is very problematic because of at least three elements. One, because it is a source of conflict, as there is no transparency regarding who's doing what and how things are being distributed with the few resources that we have. So there is no transparency regarding the specific distributional arrangements for social reproduction. Two, it is a source of contradiction because the gap between the conditions for social reproduction and the political project promises widens. And 3, it misleads public policies. And I will briefly, do I have time? 2 minutes? Oof. I will briefly refer to one example, at least, to illustrate these points and with specific reference to public policy implications. So the lack of transparency that this reluctancy of recognizing this at the public level impedes to correctly identify policy priorities and impedes synergies between academia and policymakers to happen. So if we take the example of unpaid care and reproductive work, for instance, so the insufficient recognition of the economic contributions of unpaid work, in this case also women's work, but not necessarily, so that's a point that my colleagues were making. So there are these are right now two interrelated things, but are different at the same time. So even with equal gender equality or the ideal gender equality, still it could be a no recognition to unpaid work to the, say, so-called productive economy, which is wrong. So there is on one hand this problem, so the insufficient recognition of the contributions of unpaid work on one hand, and on the other hand, there is an insufficient critical interrogation of the role of the state responsibility in this omission. So, okay, let me see how I can wrap up this very quickly. So, as I said, so these two factors impede the transparent account of social reproduction by hiding that centrality, and we have done some empirical exercises with my co-author, Professor Catherine Moos at UMass, in which we have a calculation for 1 year in which we show that the household production component, for example, in the Q1 cost of social reproduction is the major contribution, representing 31%. And this is based on a very low bound estimate. So as feminist economists have largely argued in similar ways in which unpaid domestic and care labor can be a subsidy for capital, it can constitute a subsidy to the state, allowing it to sustain steadily low wages and insufficient social provisioning. So simply ignoring unpaid work economic contributions implies free riding on others' work, mainly women's work in this case, while taking credit for it. And this is important because this will allow a more accurate diagnosis of the care crisis within a broader social reproduction crisis, right? So, and make a case for the importance of prioritizing investment in care, if possible, or care-related industries, because otherwise there will always be a residual, there will always be a result of social policy. They will never be at the center if it's not put at the center. So the care crisis within the social reproduction crisis cannot be exclusively seen as a result of the demographic challenges that we have in the country, population aging, high migration rates, low fertility, which is the frequent focus. Of course, those are fundamental issues that exacerbate the care crisis and need to be considered, but even in the absence of those issues, an analysis of how the costs of social reproduction are distributed is relevant for public policies, and therefore the economic contributions of unpaid work and the care crisis reach far beyond social and welfare assistance policies. So I think I would leave it in here, yes, so to respect your time, but I'm happy to debate or go over any questions. Thank you very much.
Extraordinary panel on which to end, but we have lots of time to keep talking. So I think we'll take 4 questions and then we can do a second round. Is that working?
Perfect. Here, stand up, introduce yourself, because some people are...
Of course. My name is Xavier Doolittle. So first off, I just want to give a personal thanks to the panel, because of a very stacked conference, this is by far my favorite panel, which is not to say anything on the others, but like this was a perfect intervention. I'm someone who comes from a very social ecology tradition, personally involved in a lot of environmental activism, and also someone who's trying to start a family. So all of this resonates very strongly with me. And I would have loved to hear more from social reproduction theory and maybe some of the panels on history or austerity and class struggle. I have 2 things to say. First is maybe a comment, food for thought, about something here locally. Here in Oklahoma, in a place called Lawton, Oklahoma, there is a company called Westwind Elements, which is attempting to do cobalt mining. And what we learned through the process of resisting this and investigating it is it's highly tied with the political structures of the Republican Party, and very specifically kind of the tech sector that we're seeing now ascended in power through Elon Musk, et cetera. And it's really interesting, and it's also very much framed in that very protectionist, anti-China rhetoric. And I think a lot about Oklahoma and its history growing up here is almost being like an internal colony. We have always been extractive, and there's been continual pogroms of our populations, especially indigenous and black population. It's not been discussed here, but like the Tulsa Race Massacre looms very heavily over the history here of Tulsa. And I think a lot about how in the kind of process, you mentioned, I think most of it is going to be exported over borders, but it's also an issue here locally, and especially with places like Oklahoma, which are very specifically designed to get rid of those protections that otherwise exist to enable that kind of extractive economy. So I'm curious if any work's been done on that, or maybe thought on that. But the last thing I wanted to ask is about the strategy and tactics for transformative change, as Sirisha put out. As I was going to share, thinking about what can we do locally to address these crises, in our organization on a social and political level. I wanted to share an example of a very common discussion I've always heard in organizations working as a militant is lack of childcare, and especially for people who are parents, being unable to be active in involvement in the movement because they just don't have the time to do so. Something myself and a comrade of mine, both assigned male at birth, very specifically trying to do this work did in a previous organization, was arrange for that childcare. And we did it very specifically to take that burden away from what was otherwise implicit social labor by the women to take care, of, children and stuff like that. And it involved, and we made very clear, we couldn't be part of the meeting in the same way. You have to separate in that. And I think that was a very small scale version. I'd like to hear maybe more from the panel and other thoughts of what can you do as transformative change. And I'm thinking more on that kind of social, political, local level, but maybe more broadly, what are those kinds of changes you can do to kind of model and to make that change? Thank you.
Alrighty, Esteban, and then back there.
Okay. Hello. My name is Esteban. I would like to make a provocation based. I was wondering about the words of the Professor Nassif and about the presentation of Debora. I would like to reflect to what extent it's possible to, as Debora said, it's woman, not just woman, but focus on woman, of course, should have also be free to choose to have children and to not have children. And she focused on the other side, because when you talk about abortion, we are always focusing on the side that they have the option not to have. But if they want to have, they also they should have the good conditions to a right to have a good conditions to raise their children in an appropriate way. But to what extent it's possible for us as humanity and mainly for women to be free, to what extent it's possible for us to set free this issue of care as we still attached to this paradigm, to this dogma of growth. Because if we isn't it necessary to think about the growth or even abolishing this very idea of growth? Because if we think that we need to grow, we need value, we need capital, and we need workforce. So shouldn't we need to break with this dogma of growth? That's my question.
Hi, my name is Jonah. I'm a grad student at UMKC and an agricultural laborer and somebody's mom. And I was wondering if any of the, love your work, all of you. I have the good fortune of being Sirisha's student. If you can speak to the inability of time use surveys like the Bureau of Labor Statistics survey to capture multitasking and the hour multiplying effect of domestic labor, and if that, in your opinion, is skewing the results and any data that we might have on how much labor is being done.
Anyone else?
I'd like to say something. I remember when if a woman, anybody called a fetus, you know, a baby. I mean, I remember before abortion. I remember, and only Catholics were cared about abortion. This was a political issue. After Reagan passed in California an abortion law, then all of a sudden he flipped because this was the new thing. Because obviously nobody's going to vote for getting their jobs sent out and all that stuff. So they had to come up with an emotional issue. And that was the emotional issue. And I do not believe for 1 minute those people are sincere. Now, some of the people that they told that this is the end of all, you know, we have to do that or God won't forgive us, they believe that. But no. How come with 8 out of the 9 Republican justices, they still upheld Roe v. Wade? What were they waiting for, 9 out of 9? You know, they had to wait till they ruined our economy. Got all this stuff passed to ruin our economy. Now they're running to do that. So I'm pretty mad about it. I'm sorry, but I am. And I'm kind of radical, you know. You don't do that to us, you know.
Yes, I think we can probably hand over to the panel and then take a second round. Just one follow-up. I would love like a little, any one of you really, but it seems like a number of you also brought up the kind of reliance on failure of accounting, a kind of chosen failure of accounting for both investment and production of value in the home to enable austerity and austerity to rely upon in turn. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that relation, because a lot of you were talking about how austerity.
That was, yeah. I don't start.
This one good? Yeah. Thank you all for the amazing questions and for being here so late in the very last day. It's very exciting to see a full audience. To the first question, comment, Xavier, is that right? Yeah, thanks very much for your comment. This morning I went to the Black Wall Street Museum. I cried like a baby for more than an hour. It's really a horrible page of the story of Tulsa, and it was really interesting to learn about it. But more directly about your question of how can we do things in our everyday lives, in our activism, and even like bigger picture types of changes, that is the question of today, right? There are so many things that I think that we can, and we actively do engage with to try to come up with more communal, collective solutions to how do we make ourselves well, right? And I love what Anamary mentioned of community is not necessarily state provision, right? And so how to get out of that trap, I think it's one of the big questions that we have to ask ourselves nowadays. And I think that especially with the administration that we have in the United States right now, right? Okay, we want more public education. Yeah, what type of education is this type of state going to provide for our kids? Is that really the step that it's going to allow us to increase the well-being in the way that we believe that makes society better off? So I think that those types of questions and how to make it collective without relying on the state structures, I think that it's the big question for us to think and to act on. Also, being an organizer and a union member for a long, long time, I think that it's unfortunately the world that we live in and the intersectional identities that we carry. As a Latina immigrant woman in most of the union spaces that I've built, I was expected to do so much work. And I probably did a lot of that work, but it is just an expectation that people quietly have. And as Luiza pointed very well, everyone in this room has some type of privilege because we are in this room. And so how do we acknowledge that and how we put that into the service of the people who don't carry those privileges? I think it's something that every day we should be thinking about. So I think that that's just my 2 cents on your very interesting question. To Stefan, I have my beef with the degrowth literature that I'm not going to enter into right now for a lot of different reasons. But I think that what Luiza pointed as well in her speech, which I think it's very important for us to think about, is that growth is not the end growth of policy. And there are a lot of other issues that we can solve before even thinking about growth. For example, malnutrition. Clara, a good friend of mine who does very good research on that from a feminist perspective, is in the audience on food insecurity. And we, as a world right now, with the population that we have right now, we produce more than 3,000 calories per person per day. There's no discussion about do we need to increase or decrease those types of basic provisions so that we can continue to live our lives in a healthy way. So I think that my comment to that is that the discussion needs to be detached from growth in theoretical aspects, because the end goal is equality and well-being. And that means different things for different countries. In the United States, fuck yeah, they don't need to grow more. They probably should in terms of politics. You can argue that. But there are some other countries that do need to grow, that do need to provide more for their citizens on average. And so to answer that question without context, I don't think it's safe to do. So I'm not doing that. And then finally, to Joanna, yeah? Did I get that right? Yeah? Yeah, amazing question, of course. It was just, Sirisha, to have such an amazing question. The time use surveys are very limited, and it's even more limiting not to have them. In Brazil, we suffer. I know that Luiza works a lot with that as well. And so they are useful to some extent. But they also have a ton of limitations. And there is a recent paper that I read that showed how much women, and especially women of color, when they declare how much time of unpaid care they did, it's not only about the multitasking, which is definitely a thing, but when they care just for themselves, when you're cooking a meal for you or when you're cleaning your own room, they don't even count that as care, because they don't consider that self-care and that type of stuff is care in any capacity. While other people, and men specifically, tend to not only overstate, like, oh yeah, I spent 3 hours doing lunch, but they always tend to declare any type of care that they do for themselves because there's an expectation that other people should do that, right? So there's definitely an issue about how we collect that data, but unfortunately, we have to keep that criticism in mind and keep pushing those boundaries. But for a lot of the economies that I try to do my work with, not even time use surveys at the level of which activity you're doing is available as of right now. So this is how far behind we are in terms of having data to continue to push those feminist arguments. But that's an amazing question. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, okay. The cobalt mining in Oklahoma, and then what tactics and strategy for change. I think you are already, and just hearing about the work that some of you are doing in Tulsa and around Oklahoma already is that, right? But I think one of the things that I didn't have a chance to talk about is that when we talk about the framework for social, it's just a framework, right? And then that framework can be used differently for different groups of people, right? So, the distribution of labor and the ways in which those labors of social reproduction would be different for people, like racialized groups. It would be different across time. It would be different for, different places in the world, right? So one, it can be used in that way. But I think what we as economists, and I mentioned this with respect to land, but we also don't do this in terms of community care, right? So the reason I brought up Nina Banks's work earlier is because that's one of the things that she talks about is the ways in which Black women engage in community work, and that is part of the work that sometimes even as, definitely as economists, we don't think about as much, but then even among feminist economists sometimes, depending on where we are located, and is that part of the social kind of fabric that we are part of, right? But in addition, I think that in the US, there's a lot of different examples of people trying to find this, right? So Che, in fact, their next speaker series really deals with that, right? So, they're inviting someone from Cooperation Jackson, and that's what they're trying to do, is find ways to not only think about mutual aid as a kind of, or locating mutual aid within the larger political project, but then there are others who are doing this too. So, immediately, there's Cooperation Vermont, which is happening in Vermont. There is Wellspring, that's in Massachusetts, and so on, right? So I think people are already thinking about this, and even outside of these official kind of, people coming together and calling themselves, or giving themselves names, people are already doing this, right? So this idea of mutual aid already exists in different parts of the world because you can't survive without it. And that's the whole point, that wage labor actually does not provide for so many people in the global south. So they are already finding ways to somehow cobble together ways of living. And we know this to be true even of racialized populations in North America. So that's that. Stephen, in terms of, I know you didn't direct it to me, but I'm just going to add that, Debora's point about the context matters, right? So in India, for instance, anyone who talks about India, and someone had this question about BRICS, which, almost kind of gave me some anxiety, right? BRICS being an alternative. India's, kind of celebrated for its economic growth and all the kind of fabulous people that it sends, as brain drain across the world. But the fact remains that India has not been able to create jobs in the last, I don't know, almost 2 decades, right? So India went through a period where there was jobless growth. So there was tremendous growth, but there were no jobs being created. And then it went through this period of job loss growth. So there was high growth, but jobs were being lost. And that doesn't even count for the fact that more than 85% of the jobs that do exist are in the informal economy. Right? So they don't have any job security, there's no benefits. So what is the point of growth if you can't even provide for people's, forget about socially determined, we're just talking about survival, right? And that survival, again, during COVID, it was very clear the state did not play a big role. And essentially people had to go back to, this is people who had come to the cities to work. I mean, they had to go back and rely on kind of, actually a lot of gendered labor in the villages, right? So, I mean, I'm kind of, growth itself is very problematic for those reasons, and then you can talk about the ecological aspects as well. Juan Martinez Alier in the 1990s had this question, right? He actually wrote a sort of opinion piece saying, is India too poor to be green? And actually it's not, right? Actually, in fact, that is exactly why countries like, this was in the 1990s before India's kind of boom and all of that, right? Jonah, your question about time use. I think the standard sort of understanding of time use right now in terms of methodology is to talk about multitasking. And I believe that if you can actually get the data from the American Time Use Survey, you can get some of that little more granular data. But I think in other parts of the world that may or may not exist, and that's what Deb's talking about. So India, for instance, has conducted its first comprehensive national time use survey only in 2019. And that doesn't give you granular data. So, but what we did with that data, my co-author Smriti Rao and I, what we actually did with that data is take some of that multitasking to actually question the idea of class and how do we construct or how do we think about class, right? Because class typically is located in terms of occupation, at least the way based on data. And so we're really looking at different labor processes to talk about how, perhaps we should even challenge the notion of, like class categories and, using time use, which I think most people don't because Marxists actually stay away from time use. It's something that feminist economists use, but not Marxist feminists. So that was one of our ways of saying you can use time use in other ways because you're actually talking about labor and you're talking about labor time in ways that, and that's a potential data source that we don't actually have, or and in another project, we also actually collected our own time use survey to kind of try and get to some of these issues of what does work mean, right? What does labor mean? And how much, labor and work are people engaged in? Natasha, can you repeat what your question? I don't think we...
No, I just, a number of people, I think actually everyone to some extent, brought up the kind of limiting factor of austerity and the narratives of austerity that themselves rely on not counting, not quite literally formally accounting for the value produced by informal and unpaid domestic labor, but also that austerity narratives rely in turn on not accounting for that. So we can say, you know, you've got numbers wrong. You know, we don't need to be talking about post-industrialism collapsing. You look at domestic production, look at, you know, post-industrial society, care economies. But if you're interested in austerity, you're not going to.
Right.
There's like you know, since Clara points out, since like the British 19th century, what are kind of, so I guess more the practical question, what are interventions in that sticking that also mean that these sort of care economies, formalized or non, will not be recognized in the figures, and then in public narrative?
I'll answer for India, because one of the things that the Indian state is trying to do is increase people, you know, like, so they've actually given up on the idea of creating jobs. So like for a while in the 2017, 2018, and you know, someone can correct me, but like it was all about like celebration of the informal economy. Like, you know, why do you need formal jobs? Why don't we actually count informal jobs? And those are jobs too. And you could be selling tea, and you could be selling, you know, like samosas, you know, like, you know, so you don't need a formal job with, you know, benefits, et cetera. And now it's, you know, during COVID, it became all about self-reliance, right? So in some ways, and we also have to account for, you know, that many countries in the global south never had a welfare state. At most, it had a welfare regime, right? And even, you know, so there is, you know, a feminist geographer who was at Minnesota and is now at Smith College, Richa Nagar, and, you know, in one of her books, she writes about sort of the struggles that the women go just to get a card to get the benefits that the state provides them, right? And, you know, when you read those accounts, right, it's you know, it's like a very minimal benefit, but you are even trying to get an identity card to prove that you are actually worthy of, you know, so it's, you know, so I feel like in some countries, austerity has always been the case. Or if you talk about South Africa, for instance, right? South Africa depends, you know, in a paper that Linosomi and I write, we actually compared the labor force participation rates in South Africa and India. In India, it was declining. In South Africa, it was increasing. What we found was that in India, it was declining because women were pulling out to engage in sort of reproductive labor, or, you know, so, you know, like, or actually subsistence production. And in South Africa, it was increasing because of immiseration. So we actually argue that in both cases, the populations are immiserated in South Africa because of, you know, after 94, the kinds of policies that, you know, tried to give employment to women. The way that women dealt with that immiseration is to increase their labor force participation. Again, very low paid jobs. In India, there were no jobs. So you had to get out and, you know, like provide for basic, you know, things that you could actually, if you had any money, you would buy. So I feel like in some ways this austerity as an official policy, I mean, there is austerity as an official policy, and then there is all of these implicit ways in which austerity gets imposed by actually not providing for, you know, like even basic jobs, right? And so I think, you know, so some of this work in terms of developing this framework is precisely to tackle the fact that there are no jobs. Where are the jobs? And they're not good jobs, right? And so people are just trying to make ends meet, however, right? Austerity or no austerity. But I'll let others talk about it for their countries.
Does anybody know about Mark Watt? He's a professor, and he came from Glasgow, Scotland. And he wrote a book, Austerity, the history of a dangerous idea. And he proved that the press will not report it. He proved that austerity does not work. He proved it. They will not publish it. They act like it never happened. And this, I mean, this
I think this is part of what I was going to say even, so thank you, yeah, on disputing discourse, but I'll get to that. I want to start through to Stephen's questions, actually on degrowth. I think that's a very difficult word, right, in general. I think people get very uneasy with it. I get uneasy with it, I can say. But I mean, there are two aspects here. Like, what is, when we think of growth, we're really thinking of, we came to a consensus in our society that GDP measures welfare, and that this, and welfare measured in that exact sense is what we need more. So one aspect, I think, of this is just, if we were able to extend the understanding of what is GDP, we already would have some solutions to this problem. So the fact that we, and this is something I mentioned, right? So the fact that we do not account, for example, unpaid labor on GDP is a problem to that. So the way we're accounting for growth is already a problem. The other part of it is that we're looking into GDP per capita, we're looking into total GDP, we're not looking to distribution. So basically what we have today is exponential growth for a few and stagnation for the most. So really what we need right now is for the fortune of a few to decrease. Actually, this is very difficult. So I have a political issue there. This is complicated. This is why I think, and I think this is a little bit to your, answering your question in a little more macro terms of like, what do you think we need to be doing? So for me, one of the agendas I mostly like embraced on the last few years has been taxation. And taxation, I mean, taxing millionaires and taxing billionaires is extremely urgent, and we are extremely far from being able to do that. To do that, we do need international cooperation. International cooperation is something that has been very difficult. And to have this international cooperation, we need people to be claiming for that. So one of like the questions I've been tackling with, and I've been in rooms with many feminist economists spending hours thinking of this, is just how do we get feminists in general to talk about taxation? How do I get people to go on the street and be against the type of monetary policy we do, for example? So how do we engage civil society on extremely technical terms and technical things? This is super difficult. So this is something that we've been trying to think how to mobilize around this kind of things. And taxation is one of those. Taxation is actually not as difficult. People understand that. But at the same time, we have austerity discourse, and many people, even though they would think that progressive taxation is important, they also have in the back of the mind that idea of like the tax burden, that tax is a problem, that they don't want to pay taxes, and they don't understand what their taxes are coming from. In the US, I think it's very difficult because their taxes is going to something horrible anyway, so this is another problem. But in other countries, really, the way to try to think of this is that taxation is part of a social pact that is part of fiscal policy. And the way we solve the care crisis as well is part of a social pact, which has been an implicit one, sexism, racism, for example. So if we actually want to get to a good type of social pact, you need a combination of progressive taxation and a reclaiming of what is the role of the state. And to reclaim what is the role of the state, you do need kind of, you need a civil movement around it, which means really disputing the discourse in economics. This is really difficult. Like the mainstream has won. People don't want to engage with that. They use all these jargons and terms, and they don't understand. They just think, wow, the deficit is a problem. We do need to cut spending. The government needs to cut spending. They don't understand. Add that to inflation, I don't know, inflation hysteria that we have many places, especially in Latin America, because we did suffer from hyperinflation. And combined with the fact that climate crisis is increasing prices. So it's a very complicated political situation. I'm not giving answers. I'm just complicating the everything here. I'm sorry. To your Jonah, your question. It's very interesting because I've been involved with the Brazilian Statistical Center, who is trying to put out a pilot for a time use survey. We don't have a time use survey in Brazil, there never was. And one of the main things they say for a reason not to have a full-time survey is an independent survey. Right now we have one question in our labor force survey, which is how many hours on average you've spent last week doing all of these things. One question with all of the unpaid labor stuck in one. And one of the reasons for them to be using this frame is because they don't know how to deal with multitasking or with concurrent activities that happen at the same time. And that is to say that time use surveys will always be flawed. Any data gathering will always be flawed. And if you have been, I don't know, if you also accompanied any of those interviews and see how people understand questions or don't understand questions, we usually get data as if the data is actually expressing what you think it is expressing. It is not. It is an interpretation of whoever is interviewed, and this is going to be a problem. But at the same time, having that data is super important. So you just need to know what are the, I would say, know what are the things that data is not depicting for you, and be certain to know what you can draw in terms of conclusions from your work using that data or not. One thing we know, and this is something that Nancy Fowler has worked extensively on, in terms of multitasking, specifically supervisionary work. So for example, you're watching TV, but you're at the same time, your child is sleeping on the next room. This is care work. This is extremely disregarded by women in general. They don't account for that hour. So hours of supervisionary care have been underestimated on time use survey. There has been ways of dealing with this. So for example, the light time use surveys that are being done now, they have, besides having all the questions, they have an extra module just on supervisionary care to try to capture that. So there has been, the data is getting better little by little. Don't worry about it being perfect. There are many other problems with it that is not just to do with multitasking, but it's important to question what those problems are. I think I'm going to stop here for now because I've already said a lot. Thank you.
Okay. No, I'm going to be hopefully very quickly. So about the transformative agenda, I don't see the solutions at the government level as mutually exclusive from solutions at other levels, let's say at the local level or institutions. I think that we can tackle all of them at the same time. And this is kind of typical of economists sometimes to think on solutions as mutually exclusive. We either do solutions at the government level or at the local level, not necessarily. So local changes come starting from organizers, from institutions to be aware of the care constraints. That's a very important first step, right? So next conference, maybe, we can think of organizing a child care if needed. So you can make a survey at the beginning and say, so how many of the participants might need care, child care in particular, and so you have that. So there are places, that's one example, right? So at the institutional level, there are things that can be done. So about ignoring unpaid labor has an economic contribution. I think that has a very, very serious consequences, as we said, not only because you are invisibilizing the labor of 50% of the world, majority women and other groups, but because it has concrete effects for the economy. So you help with that to maintain the prevalence of misleading indicators, as Luiza was saying, and kind of thinking on a very narrow sense of what economic activity is and what the economy is. Precisely what feminists are saying for a long time is we need to think in the economy as not the market spaces or the spaces of paid work, but also how the processes of paid and unpaid works kind of interrelate, co-constitute to each other, and also to think that if the market stop providing, in case that it does provide at some point, or if the state does stop providing, someone else is going to step in. And so who is, that's the big question. In the worst case scenario, in which nobody else will provide, then living standards will drop up, right? So it's, I think, connected also with the question about the importance of growth. So I have also very, a kind of difficult relationship with the degrowth literature. But anyway, so for the Cuban case, that's not an option. That's so simple. So it's not a matter of redistribution. So that's, you can talk about redistribution in the global north, perfect. No, that's not the case for Cuba. Cuba needs growth. So that's undisputable. So what kind of growth? That's another question, right? So that's, and I agree that we should be thinking on that part for sure. And that does not mean that we need growth first, distribution after. So I'm not saying that. And this is very important because this is because Cuba has been, with this level of stagnation and low negative growth for so long. So a lot of Cuban scholars and economists are really very focused on the growth part, and I think that's a mistake, right? So we cannot try to think on the trickle-down idea that we know very well, and that is not necessarily something that we need for the Global South neither. We can think on a more proactive set of policies and not a reactive set of policies, but for sure the growth is very needed. And think I'm not, so Luiza addressed all the ideas that I had in mind for the question of the time use, so I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to finish with something that has nothing to do with the questions, so I apologize, I know it's very late. But I think it's something that is important, that was inspired by the Joanne's intervention yesterday in the organizers panel when she brought the discussion that until that point was absent, about the job that she was doing with the homemakers in New York City. And I think that speaks a lot to the relationship between feminist political economy and the heterodoxy, which is a relationship that it's not conflictualless, right? So it's a relationship that has been, in a way that needs to be addressed, right? So, and Jennifer Cohen has a very interesting short piece in the American Review of Political Economy, which is precisely talking about this, and I want to highlight two things that I think that are relevant for the discussion and also for maybe for thinking also on initiatives like this one. One is that there is this idea that feminist research is about women economic issues, she says. And there is not such issues. Because everyone is affected by those so-called issues associated with women issues. So that's the first thing. So then heterodox economics still does not fully embrace feminist research. So she says either because it is misunderstood or because economists and within the heterodoxy also don't see how feminist ideas clarifies or help to strengthen their own heterodox arguments, right? So, and what is underlying this idea, I think that it's this, sense of productivism that is behind that. I agree with Cohen in that sense. And again, a narrow definition of what the economy entails. So production would not and could not exist without reproductive labor, without the co-constitution of production and reproduction processes, and of course the reproduction of labor power. And this could be at the center of, also be central for also the heterodoxy, because we cannot understand capitalism without that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. We're at the end. Bruno wanted to say one word, Scott wanted to say one word, and then I'll give you the drinks tickets. Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, oh, you want to go, Bruno? Okay, just real quick, I want to thank everybody here for coming. I want to thank Clara. I want to thank Jisoo. I want to thank Bruno. I want to thank everybody here that did it. My colleagues in the economics department and my colleagues at the College of Arts and Sciences and you guys, okay? You guys are fantastic. It really just absolutely kicked it. Every time I looked out, their faces were looking back at us. All right, that's very absolutely essential. We're going to keep this going, okay? Jesus got we have all of the contacts, etc. So just look in your email, get your t-shirt, get your sticker, start celebrating the Che. We're going to make this thing work, okay? Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. And wait, the other thing important, okay? There's a little snafu on the drinking. We can drink.